There we go. Good evening, everybody. It's Friday. I mean, Wednesday. Oh my word, I wish it was Friday. Oh, yeah. Anyway, it's Wednesday. Hi, Daz, and welcome in. I think I saw Armored Andy also lurking here, and you can hear me. Hello. Hope everybody's having an awesome Wednesday. Oh, me too. Because I don't have to work Monday. Yeah, so I'm a little mix up, obviously, but hey, it's Wednesday, and you know what that means? It's story time, and I am super excited because we are starting our next story in the arc. It's actually part of the Daughter's Quest series, and it's called A Warrior's Heart. It focuses primarily on Marin. It is the third story in her particular arc, if you guys are curious. And so we're going to start off tonight by reading that. I'm not sure how far we'll get. I'm hoping we'll get to chapter 4. See how I feel. You guys enjoy. And please let me know if the audio is too low or if you feel that I'm too loud or the music is too loud. Let me know. Because I'm still playing with levels. Because I had to redo a whole bunch of stuff not too long ago. So. Alrighty. But yes, I agree with you, Daz. I wish it were Friday. That would be fantastic. I need to look into a multi-action key thing for one of my Stream Deck keys so I can move my windows. Because I do it manually every time, and I'm sure that there's a way that I could do that automatically by just hitting a button. That would be fantastic. Maybe? I don't know if that's really a Star Wars thing, but maybe. Because I end up putting it in the same spot every time, so I think that there's some sort of function for Stream Deck where you can do that. So I actually need to look at that. But that's something for after stream. That's a tech thingy. Alright, let me get a little bit of water and we can get going here. Okay, I will see you when you get back. Drive safe. Alrighty. So this story is called The Warrior's Heart. In Mandoa, it is titled Beverd Kartha. And we're going to start off with chapter 1. Turn my music down just a little so that I'm not getting blasted by it. Alright. August 5. There's a home. They'd made it back several days later. Callista had learned well, and with some more practice would get better at evasion and tracking others trying to evade her as well. When they returned, there were signs that Marin and Jared had returned and were elsewhere in the home. It was her home, and she had grown and proven herself. But it still got to him in a, well, for lack of a better word, a fatherly sort of way. The night had gone well, and he woke before the sun could make itself known, so he sat in his usual place. He chose to go with a pair of utility pants and a loosely buttoned shirt with his moccasins. He sat in the old folding chair with a mug of caf in his hand as he watched the first traces of daylight coming through the trees. "Don't you know by now?" he started to ask as he took a slow sip. "That you can't sneak up on me, Delish?" He turned his head just enough to catch Marin coming up out of the corner of his eye and smiled. She flushed slightly and leaned down the wall near the hangar entrance. "Sorry," she said, scuffing her toes a bit. She walked carefully, favoring her right side. "Knew I'd find you out here." "It's quiet," he said, softly, looking to the forest beyond the hangar. "It's relaxing." He then sighed softly and adjusted his button tunic. "It's a home I haven't had." He looked at her and noticed that she was still limping. "You're still feeling the wounds from Bevan?" "A bit. Black," she said, softly, sliding down the support beam until she sat on the permacrete. "You worked me over pretty good." Thought he had me for sure a couple of times. She shuddered slightly as she remembered. He called me something that brought back memories. Ethan sipped at his calf some more and nodded softly. And what was that? Marin swallowed, her fingers tightening around her behaut mug. Little one, she said, softly. It's the same thing Joran called me. She shrugged a bit and then winced. I'm not entirely sure how. She sighed then. At least 3 or 4 times he could have killed me. Ethan sighed as he sat there, watching the sunrise. Can't say what stayed his hand, Marin. I can only assume that it's just one of 2 things. Either he held back for reasons I don't know, or your edge of having the Force helped you more than you realize. She nodded thoughtfully and absently rubbed her right shoulder. You're right on that, I think. Something happened while we were fighting that I'd never done before. He shot at me with his Ripper, 3 shots, I think, aimed at the side of my head. They never actually connected. Somehow I projected some sort of shield. I'm not even sure how. Something to ask Master Card or Andrea about, I suppose. He nodded and took another sip, thinking on it. Do you think it's time to visit Mountedon? There were a few moments of silence as she considered that. We should. It's been a while since I've been to the Praxium. If we do, we'd better be sure to let them know this time, told her. I understand there's still cleanup in the home system right now, and the rest of the Navy hasn't finished calming down yet. And honestly, I can't say I blame them. She nodded. I feel the same way, somewhat. Honestly, I wanted to be here helping. She sighed and rubbed the back of her neck, thinking back to the events on Coruscant. We each had our role to play, Jared said as he walked up to the 2 and stood watching the sunrise with them. And 1 extra ship wouldn't have made that great a difference. Easy for you to say, Ethan grumbled a tad as he looked over, getting a glance from Marin when he said it. She couldn't keep the scowl from her face. 2 ships might have, she muttered before looking away and slipping her fingers into Jared's. She knew better than to start that conversation. There were times, though, that she felt Ethan was too protective. And then Coruscant and Bevan died. It was not a conversation she wanted to have. Now, if ever. Jared saw the look that passed between them and gestured toward Ethan's mug. Did you leave any? Percolator on the counter, Ethan answered, motioning inside the house. He watched Jared head back in before looking over at Marin. I don't want to or need to know about you 2, but Shaza, Marin, he started. She gave him a look. Then? I don't know what you're talking about. He arched an eyebrow at her that screamed what he was thinking and just sipped his calf casually. Uh-huh, he muttered. She glared. You think we're too young? Is that it? Or is it because you're worried it will interfere with my studies? Her question was quiet. It's not uncommon for Mandoade to marry young, you know. Shaza! He yelled, cutting off that particular comment. Yeah, how long has it been between you 2? Marin held up a hand. Udesi. I didn't mean it like that. We've not even discussed it, and we won't for a while, she said, softly. Callista came out of the house then, her mug in hand. Her left hand came to rest on Ethan's shoulder, and she sent him a wave of calm. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. Just in time, Ethan told her as he took another sip and looked across at Marin. Probably saved me from a conversation I wished I'd never started. Scowling, Marin pushed to her feet. Maybe it's better if we didn't, then. Her tone was slightly defensive, and she clutched her mug tight enough that it made her right shoulder ache. Look, I'll change the subject, he said, trying to backpedal verbally, especially since he'd seen her wince again. What set off this whole thing between you and Bevan anyway? I didn't just hear rippers in that warehouse, I heard grenades, too. Marin flinched. That really wasn't a conversation she wanted to have, either. I'm not sure. Remember that flashbang that went off? One of his goons got in behind me after that and got the drop on me when I was disoriented. As to Bevan, I've never seen him before until I spotted him during the scout you sent me on. I saw the Bevan sigil on his armor. She flinched, again, feeling ashamed that she'd not been as aware. Callista sighed, closing her eyes as she tried to help them calm down by projecting a sense of calm outward into the room. She could tell Marin was getting more defensive by the minute. Ethan sighed and stood up from his chair, walking out into the grass with his mug and staying out there for a few moments as he tried to gather his thoughts. Jared had returned, and he didn't even need the force to tell him something was wrong. Ethan stayed out there in the grass and let it hang for a few minutes while he sipped his calf and tried to salvage the rest of the morning. It wasn't easy for him to do it, or at least admit that he was wrong for starting it. "I'm sorry, girl," he finally said in that quiet voice of his. "I guess I took up the idea of having to fill Jarius's role so much that I forgot you're older now." That certainly got her attention, and she stared at him open-mouthed for several seconds before staring down into her mug. Her stomach twisted slightly, and she fought to keep her voice level as she could feel tears beginning to threaten. "I don't fault you for that," she whispered, staring down into her mug some more. Ethan, he was shooting to kill. Those grenades, if they had been any closer." She swallowed and clutched her mug so hard that it shattered, the lukewarm liquid dribbling down onto the permacrete as the pieces fell. Ethan turned around and looked at what had just happened. "Now, Jared, get the word up prepped. I think it's time we visited the monastery." Without a word, Callista nodded and turned back towards the ship that rested in the hangar, Jared not far behind. Alrighty. Gonna get a little water. Baton, the Praxium. The grounds of Stefan's school were alive with activity. Students went through katas on the central grounds around the master's wheel. Elsewhere, others were in the open auditorium listening to a master Stefan had invited to teach at the monastery. Stefan was watching Dylan work the new students through basic exercises when he heard the sound of the ship's engines approaching the landing area that was carved into the mountain, closer to the grounds than the landing pad at the house. He thought about who it was, but he'd wait to ask what the issue was until they came to see him. Ethan was the first off the ship as they looked towards the collection of old stone buildings that made up the academy. Things hadn't changed all that much since he'd last been here. "All right," he said, looking at Marin and then the rest. "Let's find him." It had been close to a week since they'd returned from Coruscant, but Marin still limped a bit, and she would for a while. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been to the Praxium. It felt like months. She almost felt like a stranger. As she walked carefully down the warders' boarding ramp to the landing pad, she wore not the tunics of a student, but the loose and flowing skirts and tunic that she'd taken to wearing more lately. Her face was slightly drawn with pain, and she hung back a bit as Ethan headed off to look for Stefan. Jared had come with them, as had Callista. Callista hung back for now, trying to give Marin some space, and it was a good thing, too. Marin had closed down pretty tightly after Coruscant, and except for the exchange at the house, hadn't spoken to anyone else the whole trip, except for Jared. Stefan could sense them now and reached out to let them know he knew that they were there. He waited a few moments before moving from where he was watching Dylan's lessons and started to head towards the assembly hall at the front of the Praxium. Marin knew his destination almost immediately, and she felt her stomach knot in apprehension as she headed in that direction. The last time she'd been there had been for the lessons Anne had given her and several others, years ago. She sighed and continued heading in that direction. The front doors to the Praxium opened, and Stefan stood in the center of the hall, waiting for them as they began to enter. "It's a busy time for a visit," he said as he greeted them. "I would have thought you would all be resting on Tanagus after everything that's happened." "I'll put it like this," Ethan said as he looked towards Marin. "I think there's something we need to discuss." Stefan raised an eyebrow and looked at each of them, wondering what Ethan was referring to. When she saw him, Marin paused, sucking in a breath to try and calm herself. It only helped slightly. "Sensei," she said evenly. She bowed slightly, remembering her manners at least. And Marin, he nodded in acknowledgement. The tension in her, in all of them, radiated through the room, and he knew that something must have been wrong for the four of them to come here. "Is this a conversation we should have in a more private setting?" he asked, quietly and politely. Marin glanced to Ethan, and after a moment's consideration, she nodded. "Alec," she said, softly, It would probably be better if it's not too much trouble. Stefan nodded in agreement and motioned outside towards the direction of the house and then tapped his wristcom. Dylan, he said over the channel, I need to handle a matter at the house. It may take some time, so please see to the rest of the day's tasks. I'll take care of it, his son told him before he cut the channel, and then Stefan nodded to the group. We can continue this in my study. Ethan took the time to move the warder from the Praxium's landing pad into the valley where the card home was nestled and landed on the pad the family kept nearby. A short time later, with refreshments offered by Jade, they were all seated in his study around the center table. Marin, Stefan said as he set down his water, I have the feeling that you need to start this conversation. That also brought back memories, and it took every ounce of control that Marin had not to bolt. She couldn't fully explain what she felt, but she felt trapped, almost guilty, like Bevan getting away was her fault. It still rattled her how Bevan seemed to know so much about her. At his question, she fidgeted. It was very uncharacteristic because she was usually direct with how she felt. Yes, Sensei, she said softly, not quite looking at him. She slowly began to relate what had happened as matter-of-factly as she could. To do it any other way, she felt she'd lose what little control she had right now. So, Stefan said as he thought over everything she'd told him about what happened in the warehouse. You feel, what, guilt for him escaping? She winced slightly. Yes, she whispered. I could have done more, and should have, and yet he might know more about me than we initially thought. He called me Little One. She shuddered slightly. Only one other person has ever called me that in a similar situation. Stefan lifted a hand, knowing what she would say next. He took a moment and stood, mulling it over as he walked around the desk and looked out the windows toward the forest beyond. Marin, he started. You faced an opponent with not only a different and probably harsher training than you did, as well as he's had more years of experience in combat than you have. He turned to look at her as he finished his thoughts. I'm sure Callista and Ethan would tell you there is nothing to be ashamed of by his escaping. When you have done everything you could think of, especially in the fast-paced action of defending yourself in such a situation, there's no reason to start second-guessing yourself after the fact. Marin nodded silently, catching Ethan's eye for a moment before she looked away. She knew they wouldn't always see eye to eye, but Ethan was right, and so was Master Card. You're right, she said softly, chewing on her lower lip before she directed her next question to Ethan. I know this probably isn't the time or place, but do you feel Coruscant completed my Vergoten? I do, he said quietly. I've spoken of the circumstances when I had to report Bevan's actions to the Mandawade, and they agree. She blinked in surprise. Oh. She sat still for a few seconds, letting that news sink in. In light of the events on Coruscant, do you feel that I should continue my work to stop Kirzad, or should I leave it to the Mandawade and the Detise? She directed the question to all of the adults. Ethan traded looks with Callista and Stefan, not knowing the exact answer for her. He thought long and hard on the question, too, as he sat back down at his desk, his chin resting on his hand as he rubbed his beard. A long-time habit of his. Hey, the sniper, how you doing? Marin sighed slightly and leaned back in her chair, rubbing the bridge of her nose as she tried to make sense of it all. She wondered if she should ask about her Jedi training, but that was perhaps a question better suited to Andrea. I don't know the answer completely, Stefan finally said after some thought. Your Vergoten may be complete, but there is still the matter of your training as a Jedi. Andrea has taught you quite a bit, and I'm sure Callista has also shown you some other things. I know I told you that since you chose to walk both paths, you wouldn't have to commit yourself to the Jedi Order, so I don't know what the next step should be here. Normally, at this point, it would be time to consider putting you through the trials. Callista? He asked, looking at his other daughter. I'd like to hear your thoughts, since you walk both paths as well. She frowned ever so slightly, sipping at her customary mug of Behot for a moment as she thought that over. Well, as far as the Verdgoten is concerned, I agree with the opinion of the Mandalorian Allure Council and that of Ethan as well. I feel she's more than past it. As far as trials go, I'd say, at least in my opinion, that she's past those as well. She showed determination and perseverance despite overwhelming odds and against an opponent with more skill and experience than herself. And she remained focused. Leave an ad starting in just under 5 minutes. Stefan nodded softly, taking in her words. I have come to the same conclusion, having heard what happened on Coruscant. He rubbed his forehead for a moment. It would have to be something the Council will meditate over and consider, though, especially given the circumstances of her studies. Callista nodded thoughtfully. True, that was going to be my next question. I know some of the Council Masters are more traditional in their thinking. Marin's training has been very unorthodox, but I feel it served her very well. As do I, Stefan said as he thought on something and then smiled. At this point, I can think that there is only one other task she has yet to accomplish. Marin gasped, stifling a swear. In all honesty, she'd all but forgotten about it. Sovereign's saber had almost become part of her, that she'd forgotten she needed to make one of her own. Her gaze went to Jared and his belt, where his saber rested. You mean? Stefan nodded. A Jedi's lightsaber is built by the one who wields it. In doing so, they bond with it in a way you do not yet understand. It becomes more than a weapon, it becomes a part of you. Sovereign's lightsaber was meant for him and him alone. Though you have used it, I'm sure you have felt something distant between it and yourself. That I have, she said softly. I noticed it even the first day I used it. It's lessened over time and with use, but it's still there to a degree. She was silent for a few moments as she thought more on the matter. Would I need to wait for the council to discuss this? Stefan shook his head immediately. No, not on this. Construction of your lightsaber is considered one of your final tests as a Padawan. It would be something you would have already done by now. With recent events, there are some things we've not been as attentive to. For one of the most important stages of the process wouldn't have been possible without difficulty recently. She frowned. What do you mean? The Jedi Master looked to the others before he continued. The push of Imperial and Sith groups has come dangerously close to most of the few planets that the Jedi have known that have crystals used in the construction of a lightsaber. So close that one or two of those worlds were practically in their new territory. It had the potential to turn into a dangerous situation if a trip was even attempted. Marin was silent as she considered that. And now? I know things are still tense after what happened here and at Coruscant. It's unknown, he answered. Both the New Republic and our forces here in Katani space took serious losses. There must be plans to venture out and see what territories they maintain, but I've not been privy to such plans. She sighed softly and glanced at each of them. Are there any places where crystals can be found which aren't close to Imperial and Sith territory? The closest traditional source would be Adega, near Endor, he told her as he thought on it. But honestly, when the New Order was forming, accessing these older sources wasn't even possible. So as a result, the Jedi used different kinds of jewels to create their lightsabers. My own uses a Duran fire gem from Tatooine and the traditional crystal I was led to on Ilum. Sighing softly, she thought about that for a moment. What about any colony worlds in the Catan system, or Catan herself? Master shrugged at the question. As I said, all kinds have been used. This is something you're going to have to put thought into yourself. There's material you can read, but what is involved is entirely up to you. I'm actually going to stop there. Take a little bit of a break because our ad is starting in about a minute. Checking. How's everybody doing tonight? How's your Wednesday? I don't know about you, but I'm looking forward to Friday. I honestly thought today was Friday. Wishful thinking. Maybe it's because I'm looking forward to a long weekend. Alright. Gotta take a look at chat here before the ad starts. Oh, Decipher, how's your Doom journey going? Hope it's going well. Oh, nice. Awesome. Good. Glad to hear that. I know that you've been working on that for a while. Glad to hear that. I am going to take a break while the ad is running, and I'm gonna go get a snack. I will be right back. Alrighty. We are back from our ad. Thanks for hanging out during that ad, guys. I appreciate you. Hope it gave you an opportunity to go get a snack or drink or have a stretch like I'm doing right now. But that's super important. Alright. Get going with chapter 2. Chapter 2. On the Praxium. Marin had sat and talked with Mr. Card, Jared, Ethan, and Callista long into the evening. For her, they were family, and she valued their input very much. Mr. Card was right. Her training was unorthodox. It was almost unheard of to blend Mandalorian training with Jedi teachings, but she had done it, and from the sound of things, they thought it had turned out pretty well. The thought of completing her red Groton excited her, and yet there was a pang as she thought of Zan and even her father. Zan was the one who had suggested her task. If only they had been here to see me complete it. Shaking her head slowly at the thought, she sat on the edge of her bed and propped her chin on her knees. She and Jared had returned to the Praxium in the early morning hours at Master Card's insistence that they get some rest. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth as she thought of Jared, and of the time she'd first seen him with his completed lightsaber. Now it's her turn. With a sigh, she bent down to grab her boots, pulling them on one by one as she tugged them into place. Next came her weapons belt with Sovereign's saber, her DE-10s, and her knives. She'd also taken to hiding knives and shuriken elsewhere in case she was ever captured. She stood and walked towards the footlocker at the end of the bed. Sure, she had plenty of storage space in the room itself, but this box contained her Beskar gam. Pressing her thumb to the scanner on the lid, she waited until there was a faint hiss of air to push the lid open. Inside, nestled carefully in the trays, rested her completed Beskar gam. She and Ethan had begun working on it shortly after Jarius' death. The plates gleamed slightly, the black paint seeming to both swallow and reflect the light, while the orange detailing made it more interesting. The right shoulder plate featured the Bevan sigil, but now she wasn't sure if she wanted it to remain there, especially after Coruscant. Gently, she traced her fingers over the plates before they touched a piece of flimsy tucked into the edge of the tray. A lump rose in her throat as she picked it up and reread it. Darius' final words to her. Her stomach clenched. Her last words to him had been full of anger, and she could never take them back. She could only hope that he had understood. Biting her lip, she folded the piece of filmmusi and tucked it back into its place before she closed the lid. She was dressed again in the tunics of the Praxium, a blue wrapped tunic and a skirt with a sash around her waist. Wearing her weapons belt with the skirt felt strange, but also right. Pushing to her feet, she picked up her small pack of supplies and headed out of her room and down the stairs to the courtyard before she reached the landing pad. Brisenia was still on Nagas, so she had arranged to borrow the Wurda. Ethan would come along, at least as far as the house, but then she was on her own from there. It took them only a short time to get underway. The trip was uneventful. It was several hours later that Merrin dropped the Wurda from hyperspace and angled the ship towards the house, watching the forest pass by below them. Finally, she felt the gentle bump as the ship settled to the permacrete of the hangar. A grasp of Ethan's arm and a few words, and then she was gone, heading out on her own and taking a speeder bike as she headed towards the colony. Sorry. Oh, trying not to slouch, I promise. On August 5, the colony. Things in and around the colony were quiet. The construction was well underway, and the colonists went about their daily lives. People went back and forth through the area, but only a few noticed Merrin's approach. They had their jobs to attend to, and a visit by the planet's only other inhabitants was low on the average colonist's list of priorities. Several offered a polite nod as she came within a reasonable distance. Merrin wasn't sure what she expected, as she mostly left the colonists to their own devices unless they needed help. And to be honest, she didn't expect them to feel comfortable asking for help from a 15-year-old. Jedi or not. That thought caused her mouth to quirk slightly, and she continued her progress through the colony, returning the greetings as they came. She wasn't there to speak to anyone, yet, but she'd felt impressed to come here anyway. The Force had drawn her here, so maybe there was something here she needed for her lightsaber. A few minutes after her arrival, word had worked its way through the colony into the head delegate as she came to know him. He came up to address her directly. He offered a slight wave as he neared, moving straight towards her to make his wish to speak quite clear. Upon coming within easy speaking distance, he spoke up rather calmly. Greetings, lady. What brings you down to our settlement on this fine day? Merrin blushed slightly. She wasn't used to the honorific. Giving him a slight bow, she smiled. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. How's the construction coming along on the colony? She took a moment to look around, reaching out with her senses as she tried to pinpoint the pull she felt within the Force. He chuckled slightly and responded rather casually. Things are coming along quite nicely, thank you. And I trust things have been going well for you as well? She smiled and brushed a few strands of hair from her face. Well enough. My training's been keeping me busy, so I've not been able to come back before now. She sighed and hoped he hadn't noticed her slight limp. Are you mining for any ore to help in your construction? He nodded, having noticed her limp, and he was wondering, but he respected her privacy just the same. He responded after a moment, absently clasping his hands behind his back in a relaxed manner as he did so. Some, but not much so far. Your visit is rather fortunate. We found something during our initial excavations for the foundations that we agreed we wanted you to have. This place was yours, and you've allowed us to set up here. We wanted to thank you for that. Her eyebrows crept upwards, and she smiled slightly. I don't need any gifts, she said softly. For her, it was enough that she'd been able to help them in their time of need. But there was something in his gaze. After a moment, she nodded firmly. What is it? He laughed slightly, bringing his hands forward and clapping gently. There was minimal sound, but his point was clear. Well, I think it would be simpler to show you, as I'm not entirely sure what exactly they are. But I know we would have little use for them. He grinned widely and held up a finger in the universal "wait here" gesture. He turned, went back to his home, and returned a few minutes later with a plain, small box. This he held out to her. Inside were several different crystals of varying shapes and sizes, but all of the same type. When he returned and opened the box, Marin gasped. It took her self-control not to swear softly as she looked at them. Those are beautiful, she breathed, touching each one briefly with a finger. They were rough cut, but still beautiful, and in the force, they sang. Another smile crossed his face, definitely pleased with her reaction. And they are yours to do with as you wish. He paused for a moment and then continued a bit softer. I sincerely hope you find a good use for them, lady. She smiled. Oh, I think I can find a use for them, sir. Her cheeks flushed slightly in excitement. I don't know what to say except thank you, she whispered, feeling odd at being addressed with the honorific. She wasn't royalty by any stretch. He laughed softly and set his free hand on her shoulder. No more needs to be said. He quirked an eyebrow slightly and then continued almost hesitantly. I get the feeling the term with which I refer to you is a bit unfamiliar. I can address you by something else if you prefer. Marin shrugged, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. It's not something I'm used to, was all, she replied, looking up to meet his gaze. As to an alternative, I don't really have any ideas except Miss Durza. She shrugged lamely and reached out to gently wrap her fingers around the box. He smiled and released the box into her care before clasping his arms behind his back once more. Very well, Miss Durza. Is there anything else I can assist you with? Or anything you need to discuss while you're here? There was silence for a moment. Not that I can think of, she said quietly. What about you or the colonists? He shrugged, but paused for almost a full minute before responding. I'm not particularly coming up with much, but I will ask one thing. Would you know anyone who might be able to teach some of us to defend ourselves properly should something happen? I trust in the Navy and such, along with the seclusion here. Keep us quite safe, but I find that it never hurts to be prepared. This time she smiled and reached out to grip his arm firmly. I do. I could teach you, or Ethan could. He taught me everything I know in that area. Aaron nodded slightly, a grin spreading across his face. He gripped her arm in return, as it seemed to be a fitting response before he responded. I'd appreciate that greatly, Miss Durza. We all would. I'll speak with the others and see who is interested in learning. I'm too old and slow to do much nowadays. That won't keep me from trying. He laughed lightly. I think we could still teach you a few things. It never hurts to try. She wrapped her fingers tightly around the small box and gripped his arm once more. He nodded slightly and then responded evenly. Well then, I shall have a group of trainees ready the next time you decide to visit. If nothing else, I will no longer delay you with our trivial day-to-day problems. He laughed. It's not trivial, she told him firmly. So, I have matters of my own to attend to. She gripped his arm once more and returned to her speeder, already mulling over ideas in her head. Aaron nodded and clasped his arms behind his back as he watched her depart. He waited for a few moments and then returned to leave, going straight to discuss training with the others. Marin was somewhat absorbed in her thoughts as she returned to where she'd left her speeder. She greeted those colonists she met, but otherwise kept to herself. When she reached the speeder, she tucked the box into the compartment under the seat before she took off, angling the speeder to sweep around the settlement once before she headed off towards the house. It would take close to 4 hours to reach home as it had on the trip out, and when she got there, she knew she wanted to start on her saber right away. But she knew she didn't have the parts. Would Jarius have kept any? She wasn't sure. Give me just a moment. Alrighty. There we go. I was just checking something real quick. On August 5, the door's at home. It was quiet when Marin returned to the house. She knew Ethan was probably nearby, but he knew she had to do this part alone. She could sense him down at the range. With a slight smile, she turned and entered the house after parking the speeder in the hangar. Even after all these years, she was still amazed at how the house blended into the landscape. It was built into the rock face, and the rock surrounding it helped to deflect scanners. A few years back, she discovered blueprints for it while going through some of Jarius's things. She pored over them for hours, fascinated at the detail and thought he'd put into its construction. This place, her home, was built like a fortress. And rightly so, she thought, especially given what she and Jared had discovered when they'd found Jarius's letter. Spirit had been tracking Jarius's movements for a long time. If they'd been able to track him to the Praxium, and they knew of Tanagus 5's location, what was to keep them from looking for her, or the house itself? A chill went down her spine at the thought. That may have been what they were doing when she'd found Jaren's man on Tanagus several months ago. She shuddered, flexing her left hand in remembered pain. Not something she ever wanted to repeat, but from what Jared had gathered from the letter, it was possible. Shaking herself, she pulled her boots off and set them into the closet before she wandered barefoot into the kitchen. The scent of Beehot reached her nose, and she smiled. Ethan knew her well. Of all the things that helped put her at ease, a good cup of Beehot topped the list. Coming to herself, she made her way over to the percolator and poured herself a cup, adding a dash of ground cinnabark and sweetener and a bit of milk, stirring it carefully before she took a sip. The flavor and the scent brought back so many good memories. With mug in hand, she quietly padded down the hall and pushed open the door to Jarius's room. The datapad lay just where she'd left it on the end of the bed. Picking it up, she pressed her thumb to the reader on the front, and after scanning her print, the pad flickered to life. Sinking down on the end of the bed, she tucked her feet up and balanced the small datapad on her knees. She held her mug with her other hand. Then she began to look over the blueprints, letting her eyes fall closed as she let the Force guide her. She wasn't sure where to look. She knew her need, and the Force would guide her to where she needed to be. The house was still and silent for the most part, but it was her place, and almost seemed to understand her need. Feeling out most of the rooms would yield nothing in particular, but one specific, seemingly blank section of the wall seemed to be calling out to her. It emitted a slight pull, almost as if drawing her to it. This was particularly strong indication of where she should be looking. What it could not tell her, however, was how to gain access to the items hidden within. Marin frowned as she felt the pull, her finger hovering over the section of the blueprint that was the shrine. Her head lifted quickly, and she took a breath, almost feeling as if the breath had been driven from her lungs. Sliding off the bed, she padded out of the room and down the hall, before gently pushing open the door to the shrine. This room. Marin rarely came in here, but it held so many memories. Tears sprang to her eyes as she remembered the day that Jarius had adopted her. An ache rose in her chest, and she had to stop and breathe as she leaned on the doorframe. When she could move again, she lit the candles scattered in the alcoves one by one. The flickering light glinted off something in the far corner alcove, and she felt her chest tighten again as her gaze was drawn to it. Jarius's boise. It was among the few pieces of armor they'd recovered from Galan. It now rested in its own alcove, The plaque below read simply, Jarius Durza, beloved father and warrior, in both Mandoa and Katani script. She padded over to the alcove and gently lifted the helmet from its pedestal before resting her forehead against its dome. It was as if she could feel him there with her, watching over her. She smiled and set it back down before kneeling at the altar. This time, there was more than just the pull from the wall without explanation of what it wanted her to do. There was now a general sense of something coming from within the helmet, further solidifying the feeling that Jarius is watching over her, and it seemed to want her to do something involving the altar itself. If she tried inspecting the altar closely in the forest, she would probably find the triggering mechanism for something, the wall, in fact, hidden within it. It was a relatively simple mechanism, but opening it would take a lot of time and effort on her part. Jarius had wanted to ensure she was ready for that which lay within, whether he was still around or not. Marin frowned, again feeling the pull, much more assertive towards the altar itself this time. Expanding her senses slowly outward, she scanned the altar and the force until she grinned. There was a hidden switch inside the altar itself. It was such that only a force user would have been able to find it, or even activate it. She took a deep breath and used the force to exert pressure on the switch, causing it to sink into its housing. As it did so, she saw a flicker of motion out of the corner of her eye. A section in the base of the alcove where Jarius's helmet rested had slid aside, revealing a heavy metal crate concealed within. As the wall slid open, it triggered Jarius's final defense and test. A portion of his will that had been left there, waiting, abruptly entered her mind. It searched for several moments before finding what it needed, and then forced her back within herself, cutting out everything outside her mind. Within, however, she found herself in a blank space. No walls, no doors, no ceiling, or even anything that would serve as cover. She had all of her weapons, but what she did not have was armor, and she was not alone. A few meters in front of her stood an individual in black veskergam that she would recognize instantly. Bevan. The image spoke then, drawing his small blade as he did so. You managed to find yourself cuffed and captured in the middle of a raid you were conducting, and yet you think yourself worthy of this weapon? For a moment, Marin was disoriented by the lack of surroundings. When she finally got her bearings, her blood ran cold. Bevan. She could feel panic settling in her stomach, and she tried to force it back, her left hand flexing in memory of what Joran had done. No one is perfect, Bevan. Not me. Not even you. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do with them. She set her feet and drew Sovereign's saber. Even though she knew his blade was probably Beskar, it was better than a knife against his longsword. A mirthless chuckle was given, and he settled into his fighting stance. He didn't move to attack yet, however. But he did continue speaking. Tell you what, little one. I'll make this an honorable contest. There are no grenades, rippers, or tricks. Blade against blade and skill against skill. If you succeed, you can continue with your little exercise in futility. Should you fail, we'll get into that when it happens. He casually removed his weapons belt and tossed it off to the side as he finished speaking. Marin's stomach twisted at the thought as she unbuckled her weapons belt and dropped it, kicking it backwards away from her before she settled into a ready stance. A cold knot of fear settled in her stomach, and she focused on trying to breathe through it. She tried not to think about what might happen if she failed. She was already rattled enough. His only response was a cold, unfeeling laugh as she naively discarded her weapons belt as he had. This, he decided, was going to be fun. Less than 5 seconds after she settled into her stance, he came charging in, aiming a stab at her stomach. Marin sidestepped, sweeping her blade down and to the left to block the strike, sending it wide before she turned and snapped a kick to his chest before dancing away. It had been a couple of years since she'd fought like this, except for the warehouse, so she was slightly unused to it. The unnerving laugh continued throughout all of this, and he turned to stalk towards her calmly. When he was about to be within striking distance, he brought his blade across in a sidelong swipe towards her chest, timing it to be within reach when the attack was completed. He waited patiently for her to leave him the opening he needed. Marin took a step backwards, trying to kick to block again, and then she tripped over her own weapons belt, stumbling before she caught her balance. But it gave Bevan the opening he needed. Shaking his head slowly, almost mockingly, he drove his free hand towards her ribs, but worse than that, he fired a dart from his gauntlet on impact, leaving no room for her to dodge. The dart was coated in a toxin that would take a solid 15 seconds to go into effect, but resulted in full paralysis. She would be able to see and feel everything happening, but be unable to do anything about it. The breath left her lungs in a rush, and her danger sense spiked as she tried to draw more air into her lungs. But it was already too late. The dart hit her square in the stomach, and she twisted, trying to pull it out as she grabbed his wrist, and turned to drive an elbow to his throat. We have an ad starting in just under 5 minutes. Grunting slightly as her elbow impacted, Bevan backed off a step or two, but not before wrenching his wrist from her grasp and launching a kick towards her stomach. He trusted his dart to do the work, so he wasn't overly concerned with winning the fight, just delaying until it took full effect. Marin backed off and stumbled a bit as the dart began to take effect. She dropped, catching herself as she tried to sweep his legs. She succeeded, but by now she could barely move. She gritted her teeth as she felt her muscles going rigid. Bevan muttered curses under his breath as he felt himself falling, hitting the ground hard. He was back up quickly, however. He stepped towards her, but stopped and crossed his arms over his chest as he noticed her stiffening movement. He chuckled, legitimately entertained, and spoke rather mockingly. "Having problems, are we, little one?" Marin gritted her teeth, glaring at him as Sovereign's saber fell from her grip, the blade disappearing as she let go of the hilt. Angrily, she shoved at him with the force, causing him to stumble back a few steps. She unsuccessfully tried to move. She had no idea how long the paralysis would last. Sighing softly, Bevan carefully moved back towards her, kicking the saber farther away. He experimentally prodded her in the ribs with his boot, continuing in the same mocking manner. "It would seem that you were too trusting when someone offers rules of engagement." The paralysis would last about 10 minutes, which should be plenty of time. Swallowing, Marin glared daggers at him, breathing slowly as she tried to calm the panic. This reminded her far too much of what Joran had done, which certainly wasn't helping matters. Gritting her teeth momentarily, she tried to focus inward and draw the toxin out, but she'd never done such a thing, which was rather exhausting. After a few minutes, she laid her head back and sighed, trying to think of other options. Bevan had spent these minutes prepping some things, specifically painstakingly coating his blade in a viscous material that gave the edge of it a bit of a dull sheen. He turned back towards her, kneeling as he explained, slowly, ensuring she understood every word. "This is a nerve agent that causes exquisite pain. I'm told it's quite unbearable. Personally, I think it's a mild irritation. I want your thoughts on it when you can speak again." He slowly drew the blade across her stomach, and while the blade only left a thin cut, pain blossomed out from it. It seared like fire, except under the skin instead of on top of it. Even paralyzed, Marin could see her entire body arch in agony as the blade bit into her skin. If she could have screamed, she would have. "Oh, Amanda." It caused black spots to dance across her vision, and she gritted her teeth even as she felt sweat trickle down her neck. The pain. Sweet lady. Marin's palms turned cold and clammy at the sudden rush of pain signals to her brain. She could only close her eyes and breathe, still trying to draw the paralyzing toxin from her bloodstream. Laughing coldly again at that reaction, he retrieved his belt before buckling it back on. He moved back to Marin and crouched once more, slowly drawing the blade across her stomach a few inches higher. She'd still have about 5 minutes, but he wasn't about to take any chances. Before the pain from his last action had even begun to wear off, he rolled Marin onto her stomach and retrieved a length of cord from a pouch on his belt. He began tightly binding her arms together with this, looping it multiple times and ensuring it was secure. With that in place, he linked the bindings on her arms to wrap around her ankles. This would effectively keep her from moving her arms or legs, and even if she managed it, they would have to be moved together. Even if she figured out a way to undo them, it would take quite a bit of time. Pain exploded from the cut, and Marin felt a rush of adrenaline yet again. She gasped and gritted her teeth against the blinding pain. When he came at her again, this time with a length of cord, she swore mentally and tried to push him away with the force, shoving him hard in the chest. But it didn't do much good. He recovered quickly and had her face down, an armored knee pressing her into the floor as he bound her arms tightly and then her ankles. Marin seethed in frustration, and she could feel anger and panic trying to creep back in. She'd been relatively unsuccessful at drawing the toxin out, so she instead turned her attention to the ropes themselves. She slowly began trying to work the ropes loose with the force when he backed off again. If she could short out stun cuffs, surely she could untie the cords that bound her. We have an ad starting right now, so I will be right back. Alrighty. Welcome back from our ads. Thank you for being here tonight. I really appreciate you. And I hope you're enjoying the story so far. Not exactly cozy at the moment, but hopefully full of action and interest for you. I'm getting a little bit of water before I start reading again. Taking his head again, Bevan bent down to retrieve her weapons belt and dropped it a few feet in front of her face as he rolled her a bit with his foot so she was now on her side. At this point, he was taunting her, a bit overconfident that she was both restrained and paralyzed. He spoke mockingly again, standing with his arms crossed over his chest. It would appear you managed to find yourself captured in a fight once again. Are you even trying? That name. She hated it, especially how he was using it. She could feel the anger rising and willed herself to be calm. It only partially worked. She glared daggers at him then. Of course she was trying. but he had an edge on her in age, size, and skill. Slowly, she could feel the sensation returning to her limbs, and as it did, the full force of the nerve agent hit her like a punch to the gut. She gasped and lay there momentarily, letting Bevan think she was still paralyzed. With her hands out of his line of sight, she continued to work on the cords that bound her, carefully undoing the knots, one by one, until they loosened. When they did, she felt the ropes fall away. But she kept her hands behind her for the moment. He moved in closer and launched a kick at her ribs, almost absently. He had yet to figure out that she was no longer paralyzed, nor restrained. He was still quite overconfident. To say he wasn't taking her seriously now would be an understatement. Inwardly, Marin grinned. As his foot snapped out, she rolled away, seizing his ankle and pulling hard as she continued to roll in the direction he was already traveling. A slight smirk crossed her face as she felt him lose his balance and fall to the ground. She was on her feet instantly, calling her belt to her and buckling it on as he lay there stunned. Next, she called her saber back to her hand. With her right hand, she drew a couple of shuriken from a pouch on her belt and threw them in his direction, guiding them with the force. By this time, he was chuckling mirthlessly once again. He winced at her as her shuriken found gaps in his Beskar gem, but he stood steadily, his blade still gleamed dully with the coating. He slid his offhand ripper from its holster and fired a few rounds at her torso as he closed in with his blade at the ready. So, the Dekut finally does something, eh? About criffing time! Snarling, Marin pushed the rounds from the ripper off course, ducking around him before she drove a dagger backhanded into the gap between his belt and backplate. She drove it in up to the hilt, pulling her hand free before it became slick with blood. It was difficult for her to control her anger, but she tried anyway. She remembered all too well what had almost happened when she went after Joran, or what Jarius had been through. He grunted slightly as her blade found the gap, but continued without pause. He then turned slightly, bringing his blade up and across as she withdrew her arm. His goal was to nick her hand or wrist, at least, causing further pain from the coating and possibly rendering the limb mostly useless if it actually connected. Marin's senses flared and she ducked sideways, kicking out toward him and hoping to misdirect the blade as she shoved at him with the force. Her kick connected and she watched him stumble back a few steps from the force push as she threw a couple more shuriken, aiming for the unprotected areas on the back of his calf. Bevan let out a short growl, turning as the shuriken bit into his calf. He ignored this as best as he could, though he was moving slower now. Storming back in, he let loose with his ripper towards her chest. Upon coming into melee range, he'd bring his blade forward to stab at her stomach, but it was a feint. He waited until she tried moving or blocking. As soon as she did, he snapped the blade up and around to bring it slashing across her upper chest and shoulders. Again, Marin deflected the slugs, hearing the dull thud as they hit the ground, leaving miniature craters where they landed. She watched his body momentarily when he came in again, studying how his weight was balanced. She saw him shift and dropped, ramming her shoulder into his knees to knock him off balance as she slashed at his other calf with her saber before rolling clear. He made no sound and calmly hopped over her saber. Off balance as he was, he still managed to land a forward roll to follow after her. He'd end this with another sidelong slash, this time aimed at the first thing he could see, her left knee. His blade found its mark, and Marin yelped as the blade bit into the tender skin. That was the least of her concerns as blinding pain began to spread. She gritted her teeth and tried to block it out as Callista had shown her. It mostly worked, and she staggered to her feet again, shoving hard at his chest with the force. He met this stubbornly, maintaining his position and even making a step forward. However, this only lasted a moment before his injured leg gave out, and the force she was exerting caused him to spin to the side. It was not a very advantageous position. He aimed his ripper somewhat and snap-fired a couple of rounds in her direction, but he had low hopes for them actually finding their mark. They didn't. They missed entirely, slamming into the ground and creating miniature craters several inches from her head. She grinned slightly and pulled another knife, putting as much force behind it as she could as she threw it towards his gun arm. A deafening roar was the only response as the knife sank cleanly into the armor gap at Bevan's elbow. By this point, he was furious, and while he lost his grip on his ripper, he stormed back towards her. He didn't bother with anything fancy this time, just launching a headbutt followed closely by a stab towards her stomach. As far as he cared by now, even if he lost, he would cause as much pain as possible before he did. The headbutt connected, and for several seconds, Marin saw nothing but stars and black spots dancing across her vision. She couldn't avoid the slash to the stomach and cursed as she felt the blade hit home, followed by the blinding pain caused by the nerve agent. Her entire body twitched, but she somehow managed to grab his wrist, squeezing to force him to drop the weapon as she tried to pull him close and drive a fist towards his throat. The blade dropped, nor could he do much as she drove her fist into his throat. What he did manage, however, was to discharge a grappling cable from the gauntlet on his injured arm. This was then deflected up and around by his other arm. He wrapped back around, entangling her arms a bit sloppily. However, as he fell to the ground from the hit, it would have tightened rather painfully. Marin stumbled, tangled up in the grappling cable as she tried to pull away. Dropping his wrist, she flipped her saber to a backhand grip and tried to cut through the cable to get away. Coughing as he lost his ability to breathe correctly, Bevan nonetheless managed to continue fighting. He rolled to a pseudo-seated position, retrieving his blade as he did so. He then hooked his uninjured leg behind her knee and pulled hard, flipping his weapon to a backhand grip and aiming to slash across her opposite thigh as he did so. Marin's legs tangled in the grappling line as she went down. She could feel him intentionally pulling her off balance. As she fell backward, she tried to bring her knee up under his chin, hissing a curse as his blade found its mark just as she brought her knee up. Her legs spasmed as the nerve agent took effect, and she tried to roll clear, kicking towards his jaw. All sound from Bevan ceased. He could still breathe, but barely. As her foot connected with the jaw portion of his helmet, his head snapped slightly to the side. This delayed his response, but he forced his injured arm to close its hand on her kicking ankle as it retracted. Marin swore and pulled, unsuccessfully, to yank her foot free of his grip. When she realized this, she hefted Sovereign's saber and slashed at his shoulder, hoping to get him to let go. At first, she had been fighting defensively, but now it was clear that if she didn't try to stop him permanently, she would end up dead, or worse. He was disturbingly silent as the saber connected with his shoulder in the gap between the plates. It left a significant burn, and his grip on her ankle did loosen, and then went away entirely. He rolled slightly to compensate, pinning her lower legs under his chest plate for the moment as he made a swipe at her saber hand with his blade. Marin tried to pull free, but his weight pinned her to the ground. She did the only thing she could think of and drove another of her knives towards his neck, hoping he didn't injure her hand too severely. She remembered the last time. Duran could have cost her the arm. Him and his criffing needles. His blade barely nicked her fingers, but the coating was still there, and potent. Though extremely awkward, his injured arm shifted up to intercept her knife. The blade went clean through the arm, drawing a bit of blood from his neck before it stopped. Her left hand spasmed as the blade nicked her fingers, and she dropped her saber, hearing it clatter to the ground. Her eyes widened as she saw him intercept the blow with barely a flinch. Her hand shook as she reached for her DE-10, having used all of her knives. Bringing it up right-handed, she squeezed off 2 shots towards his chest at point-blank range. By this time, his injured arm was numb and mostly non-functional. Otherwise, that maneuver would have been much more challenging to manage. Marin's shots met his chest plate, and he spasmed slightly with each hit. The plates took the brunt of the blow, but he still felt the impact, which stung a lot. The plates she hit were severely scorched and dented inwards. He was still relatively silent, as it was all he could manage to breathe, but he raised his blade, nonetheless, before flipping it to a backhand grip and driving it towards her stomach. Marin's eyes widened, and she gripped his wrist as she tried to force him to drop the blade again. She was only partly successful and felt the blade dig into her stomach, near the left side, right about where she'd taken shrapnel on Coruscant. Even as she drove the blade in, she felt blood seeping from the wound, spreading slowly across the front of her coverall. Shakily, she lifted her D10 again and fired point blank at his chest before she fell back. The blast discharged directly into one of the heavily damaged plates, and the section collapsed as the shot tore through it. It passed into Bevan's chest and caused lethal damage. However, she found herself no longer there. She was again in the shrine with no scratch on her, and a set of lightsaber parts to find. Marin sat down hard, her fingers clenching and unclenching momentarily as her brain registered that she wasn't holding a weapon. In reflex, she looked down to check herself for injuries, and found none. Then she looked around the room, trying to calm her still racing pulse. It wasn't real. Force vision, then. Slowly, her heart rate dropped back to normal, and she pushed shakily to her feet and went to retrieve the box. Ooh. That was the end of chapter 2. Alright. Keep slouching. I'm sorry, guys. You probably can't tell, but I'm over here slightly slouching. It's a bad habit. Okay. Chapter 3. Ethan came in from the range and checked the weapons he'd taken with him, cleaning them and ensuring they were in good condition before putting them back in the proper lockers. Satisfied, he turned out the lights, the armory, and closed the heavy door behind him. The sound of the locking mechanisms was reassuring as he walked the short distance to the hallway leading to the house proper. As far as he knew, Marin might have still been out and about, so seeing her at the workbench across the hangar surprised him only a little bit. Ethan wondered what she would need over there, so he walked across and noticed something on the bench that was taking all of her attention. When he saw the collection of items, it piqued his interest. "What is this?" he asked quietly as he walked to the bench and looked over the items in more detail. Whatever it was, it definitely had her attention. Marin flushed, barely keeping from jumping at Ethan's approach. She was still quite rattled by the vision, but wasn't about to admit it, least of all to him. She sorted through the parts in the metal box, picking up a few and laying them out on the workbench. Then she drew the small metal case from her coverall pocket. It was wide and flat. This too she laid on the workbench. "Jeticod parts," she said softly, her fingers tracing over the various metal parts for a moment. Then she took a breath and cracked open the smaller box. Inside lay 3 crystals, one a deep orange, the other a silvery white, and the final an onyx. They were all rough cut. Maybe onyx? Onyx. I never could say that word correctly. Onyx. There we go. Ethan looked over the parts again, nodding as she explained. The smaller case caught his attention, and he whistled softly as she opened it to reveal the crystals inside. "Where did you get all these?" Again, she blushed. "Remember the lead delegate from the colonist delegation? I stopped by the colony to check on their progress, and he handed me these. Wouldn't take no for an answer." She chuckled slightly, hoping he didn't notice that she was still rattled. "And they'll work, right?" Ethan said as he traced his fingers over one of them. Most weapons he knew, but the Jeticod, the lightsaber, was unknown to him. To be more precise, what they were able to do in the hands of a trained master, he knew very well. It was the inner workings, the process of building it, and the lore surrounding the weapon that he wasn't versed in. Marin grinned. "Only one way to find out," she replied softly, gesturing to a stool near hers. "You can observe if you like, but keep in mind that I may seem detached. It takes a great deal of concentration to craft a saber." She continued to sort out the parts and electronics she felt she would need, laying them out in a particular order even though she didn't quite understand. She breathed out and relaxed as much as possible, letting the force prompt her actions. When she had everything laid out, she set the boxes aside and took a deep breath, slowly closing her eyes. Ethan pulled up the stool and moved it off to the side so that he wouldn't give her the feeling that he was crowding her. This was new for both of them. He didn't know what to expect. Seeing her starting to figure out the assembly was fascinating, for lack of a better word. He'd seen the result many times, most recently in the jaunt to Coruscant. Seeing one being built was new, and he wondered if only a few outsiders of the Order's ranks got to see the process for themselves. Merrin didn't care if she was breaking some long-held tradition by allowing him to observe. He was family, and he understood how important this was to her. The only comparison she could make was that of a Mandalorian crafting their first set of Beskar gam after their Vergotten. Her mouth twitched into a smile and she took a slow breath. Trying to breathe all her tension out as she began to release herself into the Force, reaching for calm. The anger and other emotions from earlier slowly began to melt away. As they did so, various components of the saber began to float up from the workbench. The wiring and circuit boards were first as she carefully connected each wire, letting only the Force guide her. She had no schematics and only a basic design idea. When the part started to float in front of her, it took all of Ethan's control to stay seated on the stool. All he had ever experienced firsthand with Merrin's touch of the Force was her ability to throw him off with mind tricks during the tests he put her through, and how she sensed her way around on Coruscant. This side of her abilities was utterly new to him, and he was sure an outburst from him would distract her, so he remained still and paid close attention. Merrin felt the spike of surprise as if from a distance away, and she sent a thread of calm in his direction as she continued to work. The components began to glow faintly as she connected them, the Force shifting elemental bonds for things not meant to be made into one whole. With the circuit board finished, she brought over the housing for the focus crystal and the blade emitter, carefully fitting them together even with her eyes closed. Slowly, the inner workings of the saber began to take shape, from the emitter assembly to the power switch, down to the power cell housing. With the power switch, she had made it dual phase, allowing both for a low-powered and full-powered blade, something Sovereign's saber did not possess. Sorry. My nerves are being a punk. Ooh. Ooh. So sorry. As Ethan watched, he could see the beginnings of the lightsaber taking shape. To him, it seemed no different than a Katani smith would work with the native metals that would be forged into a sword. It all took simple beginnings and guidance in the hands of the artisan as he hammered out the blade. Merrin wasn't one of them. Those who still practiced the old ways took years and years of learning, experience from a master. She still moved with a fluid knowledge of her own. Ethan assumed the Force guided her, for she did not pause even once. Slowly and yet methodically, Merrin continued to fit the components together one at a time, finally fitting the power cell into its housing and connecting the wires to it, followed by the power button and the small charging port near the base of the inner housing. Once this was done, she took what she would use for the outer casing, the metal pieces floating up from the workbench, what looked like the end cap from the handlebar of a speeder bike and the grip portion of that same handlebar, one side covered with a dark ribbed mesh that made it easy to grip. The rest was smooth metal. She found a small round button for the button itself that glowed a steady orange when the saber was active. This she tested by connecting it to the power cell for a few seconds. With that done, she carefully fitted the inner casing and electronics into the outer casing, threading any wires through as she connected them. Then she set that aside and began carefully shaping the crystals themselves, letting the Force guide her hand as she made each cut with a small las cutter she'd pulled from a pocket. At this point, Ethan could tell that this would be the most crucial part of the process. Feeling that he needed to give her even more room, he stood up and backed away more, even though he knew he hadn't distracted her, or at least he hoped he hadn't. He wanted to ensure she was still well focused on the task. This was the longest and most important part of the process. She was doing so without any instructions, just a vague idea, and letting the Force take care of the rest. Slowly, each crystal began to take the shape that she needed. Small bits of each stone and a cloud of fine dust coated the workbench. Orange, black, and iridescent streaks could be seen if one looked closely. A fine sheen of sweat appeared on Merrin's forehead, and she swiped absently at it with the back of her hand without opening her eyes. Finally, she set aside the orange crystal after lifting it from the table and turning it slowly with the force, looking at it and sensing it to ensure there were no imperfections before gently lowering it to the workbench. She did the same with the silvery white crystal and the onyx as well. When the crystals were finished, she slowly lifted the mostly complete hilt with the force, letting it float above the workbench as she carefully removed the outer casing to slot each crystal into place. Here, she hesitated briefly, a faint frown creasing her face as she made sure each one was oriented correctly before she slotted it into place. Ethan had seen the attention to detail she applied to every aspect, but he'd also noticed the sheen of sweat she was producing along with the lightsaber. He got up slowly to retrieve some water for her that was kept in a small chiller in the hangar. He knew Jarius kept it there for long sessions working on the ship or doing other tasks at the same workbench. He grabbed 2 bottles and set one for Marin, which was within reach, but away from the task she had on her hands. We have an ad starting in 4 minutes and 50 seconds. Marin kept the hilt suspended in front of her with the force as she carefully tested to ensure each wiring connection was sound and the crystals were seated securely in their chambers before she slid the outer casing into place. With that done, the saber floated in front of her again, pieces fitting themselves into place as a faint glow surrounded each of them. Then, it lowered slowly to the table, where she picked up the las cutter again and began carefully engraving something along the plain metal of the hilt. If Ethan looked closely, he would see the Katani script, the words of the Wrestlenair, and their remembrance. Hey Daz, welcome back. Whew. I need a break. I need some water. Okay. He saw it and nodded approvingly, softly saying a few blessings in Katani as he closed his eyes briefly. Smiling faintly, she set the las cutter aside and used the force to bring the bottle to her, taking a long pull from it before she floated it back to its place. With slightly shaking fingers, she pulled a small portable generator from the larger metal box and carefully connected the leads to the charging port on the pommel of the saber. The power button blinked slowly, letting her know the hilt was charging. You need to rest? Ethan asked quietly. You've been at this for quite a while already. I'm fine, she whispered, the shaking in her hands gradually ebbing. It was more from exhaustion and the amount of energy coursing through her body. With the power cell charging, she sat back on her stool and rested her hands in her lap as she extended her awareness to the hilt, bathing it with the force and feeling the fundamental shifts that began to take place. As this happened, she began to feel a familiar presence, and a smile tugged at her lips. The feeling persisted and became stronger. Slowly, memories began to surface, floating before her mind's eye. The day that she and Jarius had met, the day he'd adopted her first day at the Praxium. She felt her throat tighten with emotion, and she breathed a single word as she began to feel his presence more intensely, as if he were looking over her shoulder. She breathed that one word, so full of emotion. It seemed as if a fog was lifting, revealing a place they'd stayed at before when they'd broke from training near the house. He sat on a group of rocks by a stream, wearing, as usual, his utility pants that had been his marine issue, with an old loose shirt Mira knew he typically wore as a lounging shirt. Almost in thought, he looked up at her from where he'd been looking towards the stream, and gave her a warm smile that melted through any defenses she might have erected. My girl, he said softly as he stood up and walked closer, with that gait she'd missed so much. She turned then and went to him, pulling him close, burying her face in his chest and inhaling his scent. It was just as she remembered, and she felt her lips tremble as she looked up at him. To Ethan, she remained sitting on the stool, staring off into the distance. She was still breathing, but otherwise unmoving. Jarius looked down, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, and continued to smile. He could see the tears forming, and he sat back down on the rocks to be at her level and pulled her close. I'm sorry, Aaron. She bit her lip and looked away. I am too, she said after a moment as she looked back at him. I was so angry and scared for you. I knew something bad would happen, but I couldn't explain it then. He said as he wiped the tears from her eyes. It's done. When the lady decides it's time for me to come home, there's nothing I can say or do to change her mind. Fact is, we have a few moments here. We don't know how or why, but we have them. Marin hiccuped slightly and sighed, leaning into his shoulder for a moment. I don't know how to explain it either, she said softly. I felt you a little earlier. I was meditating at the altar, and I felt you for an instant, and then I was pulled into some sort of vision. It felt real. He nodded softly as she told him this, noting that she mentioned the altar specifically. You found it, then? Aye, she said quietly, but when I found it, it triggered a vision. I thought it was real. She shuddered slightly. I had to fight Bevan again. I'm gonna stop right there because we're about to be in an ad. Be right back. Alrighty. And we are back from our ad. Thanks so much for your patience, guys. I appreciate you. And I do hope you're enjoying the story. It's kind of intense right now. I apologize. But nonetheless, I hope you're enjoying. I had a lot of fun writing this. Okay, here we go. Bevan, Darius repeated, the tone of his voice changing. He closed his eyes and looked at her. After a moment, his previous mood returning. Don't focus on him. If you found that and the Force has brought you here, you must be working on what I think you are. Card finally got you to it. That got Marin to smile and she squeezed his hand. Sorry. Yes, he did. I never thought I would get to make one of my own. Her voice was slightly odd. You'll never guess where the crystals for it came from. He cocked his head sideways, wondering what she was fixing to tell him about them. Her smile widened, and she gripped his hand tighter. A few months ago, Andrea came to me about some refugees wanting to settle here, on Tanagas. She held up a hand. They settled in the southern hemisphere and have left me alone. I recently visited, and their leader handed me a box containing the crystals. He insisted I take them. He wanted to thank me somehow for giving them a new home. He chuckled. As soon as I touched them, I knew that they were the crystals. Who would have thought it? He said with a slight chuckle as he thought about that. Have they been good neighbors? Well enough, she said softly. They leave me alone, and I leave them alone. It works out well. Odd, though. I guess that makes me the de facto watchman of the system. Huh. If you decided to walk that path, I told her. You know, the Navy keeps a battle group patrolling the area, and there are barracks on one of the inner planets. You could keep to yourself there, just like the colonists do. She grinned slightly. I could, yes. And for the most part, I do. But I still want to be around if they ever need help. I can get there faster than the Navy. She winked. Though, I see your point. She finished quietly. Darius nodded and smiled at her, but suddenly looked off to the side and then back at her, sadness in his eyes. We haven't got much time left, he said, as he stood up and looked at her again. But since we've had this chance to say what wasn't said, He couldn't stand it as he knelt again and traced her cheek. I'm so proud of you, Marin. Boer, what's wrong? She whispered, gripping his hand tightly. When he stood, she looked up at him, and when he knelt and his worn fingers traced her cheek, she felt her heart skip a beat. I love you, Boer. I always will. You're still alive, and here. She tapped her chest and leaned forward to hug him firmly, burying her face in his chest as she did when she was little. And I always will be, he said as he held her close, noticing their surroundings beginning to fade. He pulled back and looked at her with a warm smile, which was slowly beginning to fade as well. And I love you too, Marin. Give Ethan my regards. She smiled, reaching out to brush his cheek, but his form was already fading. I will remember you, she whispered, slowly returning to herself. Marin, Ethan said firmly as he laid a hand on her shoulder. Marin, snap out of it. She twitched, taking a deep breath as she opened her eyes. A single tear traced its way down her cheek. How long? She asked, her voice cracking slightly before she reached for the water bottle and downed the rest. Several hours, he told her, handing her a fresh bottle. The charging cycle completed itself a while ago. You've been in that state ever since you started. She frowned and shook her head as she tried to organize her thoughts. Clearing her throat, she turned to look at him, holding his gaze. Ethan, I saw Buir, she breathed. What? Ethan asked, almost dropping his bottle when she said that. Oh. Her frown persisted as she tried to figure out how to explain it. The vision. It's like when I mind tricked you, you would see things. I saw Buir. It was as if he was standing right here. I felt him. I talked to him. She sighed softly. I finally got to apologize for my last words to him, she finished in a whisper. Well, I'll be, Ethan said with a chuckle as he leaned back against the workbench. I wish I could have seen that. Me too, she said, quietly brushing sweat-damp hair from her forehead. He wanted me to pass along his regards, she said softly, quieting momentarily as her thoughts returned to her earlier vision. He would, he said with a grin, and then looked over at her sudden shift in mood. What's wrong? Sighing, Marin rubbed at her forehead, trying to make sense of it all. I had another vision when meditating in the shrine. I'd gone there because I felt the force pulling me to that room. I went to the altar, knelt, and found the box of parts. When I found where it was hidden, it triggered some sort of force vision. I think it was a test to see if I was ready. She shrugged. I've never experienced anything like it before. For now, she didn't mention having to face Bevan again. Well, if this is any clue, Ethan began, gesturing towards the now completed lightsaber on the bench, I'd say you have passed the test. Now the big question is, does it work? Marin grinned. Grabbing the completed saber from the workbench, she hefted it in her left hand, testing its balance before bringing it to a solid two-handed grip and turning slightly away from him. Her thumb pressed the power switch, and the button glowed a soft orange as the familiar snap hiss sounded in the room between them. It was deep and resonated slightly. The blade that appeared flickered for a moment. It was a deep orange color with a black core and had a silvery sheen to it that seemed to coruscate up and down the length of the blade. "Dear lady," Ethan said as he was starting to be mesmerized by the pattern and had to turn away and shield his eyes. "I'd say those crystals work. I'd love to see the look on Card's face when he sees that." "So would I," she said. Alright, and that is the end of chapter 4. Guys, what are we doing? Alright. Before I continue, are there any questions? Because that was a lot. So please, if you have questions, comments, concerns, emotional outbursts, let me know. I'm pausing for a few minutes so we can discuss if you like. Please feel free. Would love to hear your thoughts. So, not necessarily comfy cozy to start, but intense. I think that's a good thing. I don't know. What do you think? Bad. Alright. Alrighty. Nobody has questions. Really? Hey, don't say I didn't ask. Sure, you'll have questions a little bit later. Right. I will have some time at the end if you decide you have questions. I know, right? That's me waiting for your questions. I would be very curious for any questions you have. Please take some time and think about that, because I don't know about you, but this story really, I find it really engaging. So I hope that you guys do as well, and I would love to hear your thoughts. But for now, I'm going to continue with chapter 4. And at the end, I will see if anybody has any questions. I would love to answer questions about the story itself, the writing process, anything of that nature. I'd love to know what you guys think. Alright. Myself some more water. Alright. Chapter 4. Since Marin's departure, things in the colony had significantly improved. As an extra bit of reinforcement, before the settlement started being built, they'd installed a series of sensors that would trigger if anyone crossed out of their designated area, specifically if they were heading towards the Durza residence, or where they assumed it to be, given that that was where they were told to avoid. And said sensors had been tripped. Even more distressing was that everyone from the colony was accounted for, and so a volunteer had been called to look into the matter. This was over an hour ago, when the middle-aged volunteer was trudging almost carelessly through the forest, following what she hoped was the right trail. After all, the only thing she had to defend herself with was a straight-edged carving knife, and she'd hate to come across some manner of creature. Brushing a stray brown hair back out of her face and sighing in frustration, she started muttering absently, "Stupid sensors. What's their point, even? We all know not to come this way, and when someone else does, they send me out without assistance, I might add." Marin sighed. Things had been relatively quiet around the house since she'd completed her lightsaber, and for once she was glad of the silence. For too long she'd been going from mission to mission with hardly a rest. So the time at home was welcome. She'd walked out into the forest surrounding her home, her new saber clipped to her belt. She wore utilities, a deep mottled green, the jacket and pants, along with some heavy boots. As she got further and further from the house, she breathed deeply, letting the forest sounds surround her as she reached out with her senses. There wasn't much that felt off. though she did pick up one of the colonists closer to her lands than usual. That didn't cause too much concern, but they would generally notify her if they intended to be anywhere close to her territory. She'd gotten no message, which she found strange. As she moved along silently, her left hand slipped to quietly slide one of her DE-10s from its custom holster on her left hip. I mean, what is with the— yeah! The woman had kept rambling as she walked, making it about another 5 minutes before this turned into a deafening yell. This would be because of the surprisingly well-hidden net that had shot up from the ground when she stepped in the wrong place. Hanging there silently, she contemplated the origins of this for a few moments before she decided she didn't care. Growling a bit, she sawed away at the thing with her knife, though she wasn't particularly effective at making any headway. Not far off, an armored head turned silently to scan the area. They'd heard the trap go off, which meant someone was nearby, but they weren't going to check on it quite yet. Better to make a circuit around, just in case. Marin felt a surge of surprise and turned in that direction, closing down on her presence in the force as she moved closer. She frowned when she saw the net, fingers clenching around her DE-10. Crouched on the tree branch above, she scanned the clearing below. Whoever put this thing here, I'm so going to give you a stern talking to when I get out. It was only one of many statements the trapped woman had shouted as she worked on freeing herself. She'd cut through one rope, but that wasn't enough to get out. Meanwhile, the armored figure slowly worked around the area, passing unknowingly under Marin. However, they wore a cloak in mottled earthy colors, making it almost impossible to spot them in the forested area below. In addition, their presence could not be felt in the force, so it was impossible to detect them at this point. Marin felt something strange, which made her skin crawl. That same almost there feeling she'd gotten from Ethan when they'd first met. Over the years, she'd learned to sense him, but the presence of whoever else was here, including herself and the colonist, eluded her. For a long moment, Marin studied the trap. It was similar to the one Laurel had used a year ago when she'd been captured. The memory sent a shiver up her spine, and she studied it closely, looking for a way to break the rope that held the net aloft without using her blaster. But would that help the woman or make the situation worse? After another minute, the armored intruder decided the woman was alone and stepped out next to her. The cloak covered the entirety of his being, and it wasn't easy to tell if there was armor underneath. However, there was a bit more bulk than expected with his size, so it was a good bet. They spoke after a few seconds, revealing themselves to be male, at least. You seriously followed me? Why would a freaking colony care what I do outside its borders? You know what? Irrelevant. His right arm shot out, revealed to be grasping a spear of some sort that stabbed towards the trapped woman. Surprisingly, she twisted to avoid the thrust and grabbed the shaft of the spear. She pulled her attacker close before his other fist met her face. He backed off, but didn't know that she had lifted a holdout blaster from his boot in the short exchange. Ooh, have fun! Enjoy! Marin's eyes narrowed as she watched the exchange, and her fingers tightened around her DE-10 as she saw him lunge at the trapped woman. She knew the woman wasn't skilled in combat, but Marin didn't want to announce herself too early. Taking a deep breath, she sent a thread of force towards the man's blaster, disengaging the safeties as she caused the blaster to overheat. He would either drop it or get burned. Swearing profusely, he dropped the weapon and went for the one in his boot. There weren't supposed to be force users in that colony. It took until his hand reached his boot for him to realize that the weapon wasn't there. Less than a second later, this was confirmed as the bolt lanced out from inside the netting and hit his shoulder. This barely made a hole in the cloak, much less his armor, but it certainly surprised him. Even as he started to say something, the woman's knife finished its work on rope number 3. She dropped to the ground, landing in a crouch with the stolen blaster aimed and her knife held on a proper backhand grip. Marin smirked as she watched the scene play out below. The woman knew what she was about when it came to a knife. Nodding approvingly, Marin remained crouched on the limb above for a moment. Her DE-10 held firmly in her grip as she reached out again, causing a dead tree branch to fall from its resting place against a tree a few dozen meters away. The cloaked man swore quite loudly this time, his gaze and attention snapping towards the sound of the falling branch. However, the trapped woman used this as an opening. Skittering in, she brought the blade across his shoulder, which she'd hit with the blaster. It just skidded off the plate underneath and entangled itself in the cloak. The man abruptly turned, bringing his palm up under her chin. At the same time, he undid the clasp on his cloak with his spear hand before he brought it swinging across to entangle the woman as she fell. A muffled curse was uttered from beneath the cloak, but this stopped when a swift kick was delivered. Without the cloak, the man was revealed to be wearing a set of Beskar again. It was made of overlapping plates, almost like scales, and painted in a scattered brown, gold, and green pattern. The most distinctive feature, though, was the sigil on his upper left arm. Yurtsad. Marin swallowed, her suspicions confirmed. She had to admit, she wasn't surprised to find Kurtzad so close to her lands. But the fact that they had gotten this close scared her more than she wanted to admit. It meant that they still had good intel on her whereabouts. She thought they'd been cleared from Tanagas months ago, but she was wrong. Her blood chilled as the realization hit her, and she swore under her breath, crouching on the limb for a moment as she studied the situation, and drew one of her knives from concealment. She held this in her fingers as Ethan had taught her. A breath in, and she let the blade fly on the release, speeding towards the trapped woman, but not to kill. Her blade caught the cloak's edge and dragged the fabric backwards, partially freeing the woman before the cloak was pinned to the tree. Marin was already on the move, silently moving to another tree, her fatigues blending in with the forest as she landed soundlessly on a branch several meters away. Buttering a few curses in Mandoa, none of which she actually completed, the Karatsad glanced over at the thrown knife for a moment. His own suspicions were confirmed. He laughed mirthlessly. He flipped the spear to reverse grip and rested the now downward-facing point on the semi-trapped colonist's chest. She was still dazed from the kick and wasn't moving fast enough to do anything useful. The man's voice rang out again, a slight edge of malice evident this time. "We have a mutual friend, Delish, or I guess we did. Remember the name Joran? Now, I would very much like to settle the matter of him dying, but I can't do that with you hiding like a hutun. So come out and drop your knives and blasters, or I will not hesitate to kill this woman. It would be easy, like dropping a needle." He seemed to know what weapons she had, but the info was naturally outdated due to the recent addition of her lightsaber. Marin swore under her breath, her fingers tightening around the grip of her DE-10 as she balanced on the branch above them. She'd been right, and that scared her. They shouldn't have gotten this far into Gotani territory after Galan. She wasn't about to drop all of her weapons, not after the vision she'd had of Bevan. Taking a deep breath, she shoved hard at him with the force, shoving her spear wide before it embedded into the tree behind the colonist. In the few seconds he spent trying to pull it free, she backflipped off the tree branch and landed and crouched a few meters behind him. Sighing almost absently, he turned to face her as he finally tore the weapon free. Smirking slightly under his oddly designed buoyancy, he shifted to a ready stance. His right leg was back with his weight on the left, and his left arm was bent at an angle in front of him. His spear was balanced slightly across the top of his arm, his right hand gripping the shaft firmly. If anything was evident from how he moved, he was no novice. Behind him, the colonist woman groaned softly as she tried to collect herself enough to move. Marin gritted her teeth and set her feet, her DE-10 in her left hand and a knife gripped backhand in the right, sorry. I can't read. Her saber was clipped horizontally to the back of her belt and hidden by her fatigue jacket. Her tone was ice. "It seems you know who I am. As to Joran, he deserved his fate. But why come after me?" Her eyebrows rose quizzically. She paced to his left, watching for his reaction. He shrugged slightly, turning slowly to keep her in front of him, but otherwise making no movement, aggressive or otherwise. Personally, I would like to know what exactly happened between you and him. I've been here for some time, wandering aimlessly under orders to find the residence of someone named Durza, so I was out of the loop. Next time I hear anything, Duran and many of his subordinates were wiped out by yourself and others. My question is, why? What exactly did you have against each other? Marin swallowed hard, her gaze flicking to the colonist for a moment as she weighed his questions. After a moment, she straightened. And you think roughing up the colonists and others is any way to get answers? We've had more than enough Kirthod presents in the last few months, she replied acidly. Laughing rather lightly, he shook his head momentarily before he responded. Not my fault she followed me, and I wasn't about to let my presence here be known, given what happened to my associates. Besides, I needed to talk to you. And how could I be sure you were going to even be civil? The last thing I need is to get killed because I took a chance. The woman's hand shifted to rub a spot on the back of her head for a moment, finally focusing enough to figure out what exactly hurt. Taking advantage of her assailant's distraction, she closed her fingers around Marin's thrown knife and hid it under the cloak before turning to appearing helpless. We have an ad starting in just under 5 minutes. Marin scoffed softly. You talk? And what makes you think looking for my home will in any way incline me to speak to you? Her grip tightened slightly on her blaster as she looked over at him. She didn't lower her weapons, and her tone was wary. Why do you care? There was a moment's pause, and the point of his spear wobbled slightly as he contemplated her question. It steadied then, just before it came to rest against the ground. He lowered his arms to his sides, though his stance was still in place and ready. He wasn't entirely trusting her, either. Looking for your home was my only objective, and given that everyone that knows where the Krith I am is now dead, I had nothing better to do. And why do I care? I care because, quite simply, I'd like to know what caused Duran to be so reckless when it came to you. That got her attention, and she stared at him in open-mouthed surprise. What do you mean? She asked. She still held her D10 ready, watching him closely. Another shrug was offered at her question, and he momentarily glanced down at the colonist. She was immobile, still looking dazed and helpless, but gauging the situation carefully. The man sighed as he looked back at Marin, and then responded. That base you wiped out on Galan and then Bessine? Every last person who knew I existed was there, and Duran was far from stupid. But when it came to you, he was reckless almost to the point of being a Jirela Dikut. As a result of that, he and the others are now dead. He seemed between pain and angry, but what any anger was directed at was unclear, and still he made no aggressive moves. Again, Marin frowned. She could tell the woman was biding her time. For now, Marin kept her attention on the Kirthod across from her. She waited for a few moments, studying his body language before she asked softly, What do you know of Jarius Durza? Sighing quite heavily this time, he shook his head helplessly as he responded. I know Duran took a lot of risks to kill someone by that name. More than usual. This indicates a personal vendetta, but other than that, I only know that he owned the residence I was sent to find. And of course, that he adopted you. A cold lump settled in her stomach. How much they knew scared her. Aye, she said softly, I'm not sure it's my story to tell. What would you gain by knowing this? Dead silence fell at her question. It took a solid minute for him to think. And when he finally did respond, it was unsure. I don't know, honestly. Knowing what caused this might help me accept why I'm stuck out here. Maybe? The colonist tensed slightly, seeming to prep for something, but it was unclear what. Sighing, Marin leaned against the tree, keeping her weapons ready. What exactly do you know? What did Duran tell you? Oh. Okay. I was told what I needed to know, nothing more. I was told where Kiritsad thought your residence was. Apparently they were off by a great deal. I was also given a name and a general description of the appearance and weaponry of one Marin Durza. Beyond that, I'm out of the loop. His left hand came across to press a pair of fingers into his right wrist for a moment, and his grip on his spear relaxed slightly as he did so. The colonist shifted rapidly, bringing the stolen held-out blaster up to discharge a stun blast at the small of his back. Oddly, however, the man reacted before she finished squeezing the trigger without looking. The plates just below his left elbow shifted apart for a moment, and a small disc slid down to the middle of his gauntlet before it projected a disc-shaped energy shield with rounded edges that covered his entire forearm. He snapped back to block the shot, but made no movements beyond that. He just kept looking directly at Marin. Marin swore softly in surprise, her eyes widening as she watched his reaction. He was a Force user. She was reminded once more of Laurel, and a cold lump of apprehension formed itself in her stomach. She briefly glanced over to check the colonist before returning to study his dark visor. If I tell you this, what will you do with the knowledge? It's not something I share lightly, or with just anyone. And I'm gonna stop there, because we have an ad starting very quickly. I will be back in a minute and a half. Take some time to get a drink of water while I can. See you in a minute. Welcome back from our ad break, friends. Hope you're enjoying the story tonight. I'm definitely enjoying reading it. I hope you're enjoying hearing and listening, even if it's not cozy. Right. He sighed softly, slowly rotating his spear in as non-threatening a manner as possible until it was pointed down once again. He then drove it into the ground before sliding his shield projector back into concealment. Crossing his arms across his chest, he responded calmly, "I will use it for my own peace of mind. Nothing more. Not many people around to leak it to, anyway." The colonist had stared blankly at the man's back through this, not daring to lower the blaster. Her finger was off the trigger, however. She knew when to not do something foolish. Interrupting an exchange between two Force users was definitely on that list. Frowning, Marin lowered her to E10, but didn't holster it completely. This was going to take some time. Her attention was on the armored form across from her. She wasn't sure how much the colonists knew, but she hoped what she was about to share didn't get spread around. As you already know, I was adopted by Jerry Esturza. By Katani and Mandawad traditions, I am his heir. His elite. What I know of his past was gathered from talks with him and others who knew him well. She paused and looked around at both of them. He was a Katani by birth before he became a Mandalorian, and he served in the Katani Marines. From what I've gathered, there was some incident involving my father and Joran. It resulted in Joran's dishonorable discharge from the Marines, and he served some time in prison. After that, Kirtzad sought him out for his skills and the knowledge of the Catan system. I'm unsure what happened during the intervening time, but Joran had spent considerable effort trying to recruit my father for Kirtzad. He refused, so Joran had his wife and unborn child murdered and shipped home to him in a box. Then my father went on a rampage of his own, hunting down the people responsible, questioned them, tortured them, and then killed them. She shuddered at the memory of hearing it and feeling Jerry's self-loathing of what he had been. But Joran didn't stop there. He could keep tabs on my father to the point he traced him here into Catan many times. He wouldn't give up. He wouldn't join Kirtzad. Joran felt he deserved to die, and so he set out to do just that. Her hands clenched against her legs as she remembered it in her burning rage. There was silence for what seemed an eternity when she finished, but in truth it only lasted a few seconds. This was broken by the man's right hand moving up, resting its fingers where his temples would be as he shook his head slowly. I see. That stubborn Jakar. He sighed heavily and returned his arms to their cross position on his chest before continuing. And so, here we stand, the result of something that started years ago and turned into a vendetta. I appreciate you telling me this, Delish, and I honestly don't blame you for not taking me at my word, given what was just detailed. He turned slightly to look at the colonist and jerked his head, indicating she should stand. This she did, though she kept the blaster aimed and had Marin's knife in a reverse grip. Marin sighed and reached out with her free hand to lay it on the woman's shoulder. She sent a wave of calm towards her. I don't think you have anything to fear, she said softly, her gaze never leaving the black visor of the man across from her. Then she began to piece together what the woman might have been doing there in the first place. Please, you can return to the colony if you wish. Her gaze slid back to her, and then, I learned the hard way not to take people's words at face value. If Joran thought that there was anything to be gained from hunting down my father, murdering him, and then torturing me, and Manda knows who else, I feel that his death served a purpose. Nodding slightly, the man bent down and fished in his cloak momentarily, standing again with the woman's knife in his hand. I have no use for this, so by all means take it back. I have nothing to gain from depriving your colony of even a small tool. He then tossed it to her lightly, and she gently set the blaster down before catching the knife, quickly and calmly. Smiling, she turned and returned Marin's knife before heading towards the colony. Her muttered ramblings could be heard then, trailing off slowly as she moved further away. Shifting a bit after the colonists left, the armored man casually indicated the blaster next to Marin's feet, silently requesting its return. He spoke once again, quite matter-of-factly. Now, you have given me information that you have no real reason to. It's only fair to respond in kind. Is there anything you would wish to know? Taking a deep breath, Marin dropped to a knee to retrieve the blaster and nodded as she stood up. There is. It's been bothering me for years. How is it that Joran was able to track my father so accurately? I know my father was always cautious. She fell silent for a long moment as she hefted the holdout blaster. It was small and light, reminding her of the one that Jarius had trained her with when she was young. Quite simply, an excessive amount of effort. I wasn't briefed on the whole setup, but I know that just about every one of Joran's contacts, associates, subordinates, you name it, knew what Garbur looked like and were asked to report any sightings. Combine that with surveillance teams on many nearby planets and moons, and it becomes hard to miss him. Here, however, is where the difficulty lies. I never could figure out where exactly he lived. We knew it was here, but the last intel I had been given placed it a good distance south and west of here. Shrugging slightly as he finished, he brought his hands up to his boise and disengaged the seal. Sliding this off, he was revealed to be relatively young, probably only a year or two older than Marin was. His jet black hair extended down to his shoulders, and his eyes were a startling, vivid green. A jagged scar ran across from the left side of his forehead down to his lower right cheek, but otherwise he was pretty ordinary looking. He held the boise under his left arm casually, waiting patiently. Marin blinked, not having expected that. She frowned as she listened to his words, her fingers clenching around the grip of her blaster. She tucked her knife back into its hiding place. She was silent and blushed when she realized she was actually staring. Flustered, she looked away for a second or two. Will it end? Duran is dead. My Buir is dead. She shook her head slightly. As to the location of my home, it should remain a mystery. I want this crusade against my family and those I care about to end. But will it? It can't be that simple. She shuddered slightly. She thought about her 2 encounters with Bevan. She was still healing from the one on Coruscant. He sighed in exasperation and stared blankly at the ground for a moment before he shook his head and responded, Who knows? The matter with Joran, I know, is settled. After all, we appear to be the only 2 directly involved in that remaining, and I see no reason to continue. As for any other conflicts, I honestly can't say. I'm alone and don't know what the criff is happening elsewhere. Frowning, Marin flipped on the safety before tossing him the blaster. She kept her DE-10 ready, however. And what will you do now? Smiling slightly, he caught the blaster and slid it back into his boot. There was a moment's hesitation before he shrugged again and dropped his arms. I hadn't really thought of that. Even if I managed to find some way to leave this place, I'd probably just be killed by the others for returning, having accomplished nothing. I don't want to stay here by myself, either. He trailed off for a moment and then seemed to come to a decision and continued rather formally. And so, I now offer myself as your prisoner. Actions have consequences, and I attempted to kill a colonist that I'm assuming is, if indirectly, under your protection. I know you have no reason to trust my word, but I'm willing to trade what information I have for a place to stay and someone to talk to. You may have possession of my gear, and I honestly don't care if you decide to keep me confined somewhere. Nor do I need to know where you reside. As if to reinforce this, he calmly detached the entirety of his forearm plates, letting them fall to the ground. He then did the same with the knees, the underside revealing spring-loaded darts. Sorry. Ouching! Again, Marin gaped at him in surprise as she watched him remove parts of his Beskar. A frown crossed her face. You would do this, knowing that I could not let you leave? What's to prevent you from trying to leave when I look away? I know you are a Force user. The last words were whispered, and her free hand rested on her hip as she hooked her thumb through her belt, not too far from where her saber was clipped. Shrugging again, he met this calmly by aiming his left arm out to the side, away from either of them. He carefully let the force flow through him, and at the moment where it should have manifested in some manner, it simply fizzled, for lack of a better term. He let his arm drop back to his side and resigned himself to staring at the ground again. I would. And what would prevent me is that I have no better option at the moment. As for being a Force user, I technically am, but at best I can only read others' next actions. Any attempt to use what most deem true abilities have failed miserably. Marin frowned slightly and reached over her shoulder for the small backpack she'd brought with her. It held rations and water, but there was still plenty of room to stow his armor. For a moment, she chewed her bottom lip nervously. Never really been in a situation such as this. The house did have a secure holding facility nearby, but not in the house itself. She set the pack down and pulled a pair of stun cuffs from her belt. Turn around, Gadetier. She tried to be mindful that he'd been cooperative thus far and treat him accordingly. She wondered what story the woman would share with the rest of the colony. He offered a slight nod and complied calmly, using his boot to slide his discarded Baskergam a bit further away from himself as he did so. He bent down slightly to place his Boise on the ground and then put his arms together behind his back. She seemed to trust him, so he tried hard not to break that. After all, he was alone out here. Biting her lip, Marin closed the stun cuffs around his wrist, listening until they clicked into place. When she was sure they were secure, she knelt to retrieve his armor pieces and weapons, carefully placing them in her backpack and ensuring the safeties were engaged on his blaster. With that done, she flung the pack over her shoulder and stepped forward with a dark bandana, which she would use as a blindfold, much as Ethan had years ago. "I have to," she said, not quite looking at him. Nodding slightly, as if knowing exactly what she was doing, which he did, he spoke softly. "I understand. Necessary for your own safety and peace of mind." She nodded once and reached up to tie the blindfold in place. She then waved a hand in front of his face. "Can you see?" Her question was curt as she took his arm in a firm grip and turned him slowly and firmly around. She'd have to take the long way around, and the trip to the holding facility would take a good couple of hours. Shrugging slightly, he responded rather casually, "Well, I can feel you, but as far as actually seeing, not a criffing thing." He did his best to move along with her and how she directed him, and he was doing rather well. This indicated experience with blind fighting. Taking a slow breath, Marin concentrated on guiding him toward the holding area without going directly there. She wasn't sure how much of the moon he'd actually explored, but if he'd been here for months, it was a good bet that he knew the moon almost as well as she did. That wasn't exactly a comforting thought. After close to 2 hours of hiking through the forest, they finally reached their destination. It was a small building on the side of a hill, mostly hidden from sight. The walls were made of native stone and reinforced with durasteel. Inside, there were 4 enclosed cells with security fields. The fields functioned on a self-contained system with a backup power source closer to the house. The holding area was wired for surveillance and fed to a guard station on the upper level. It was also uplinked to Marin's Boise, as she'd been wearing it. The upper level also housed a small food prep area. Pretty much all that was there was a ghee hull and the ingredients for making bihant. She felt it was wiser to keep food that wouldn't spoil and wouldn't need to be replenished as often. A grinding noise followed by a heavy thunk as the blast door slid aside after Marion entered her security code. Once they stepped inside, the air was cooler and the sound echoed ever so slightly, their footsteps bouncing off the walls as they walked across the room. The interior lights flickered on, illuminating the somewhat cramped bunker. Taking a moment to orient herself, Marin guided him towards the nearest cell, a soft pop announcing the deactivation of the security field as she did so via her wristcom. "Here we are. In you go," she said firmly, deactivating the stun cuffs and catching them in one hand as she undid the blindfold with her other hand. Catching that, she stuffed it into a pocket and tucked the cuffs into her belt pouch, as she gave him a gentle but firm nudge towards the holding cell. The young man was patient as she led him along, intentionally not noting what general direction they were going. He'd given his word not to know where she resided, so he would ensure he did not. His arms were mildly cramped when they arrived, but it was a minor inconvenience. As the cuffs and blindfold were finally removed, he took a few steps forward without question before turning around. He interlocked the fingers of his and extended them up above his head, stretching, but otherwise just took in his surroundings and remained silent. With a slight frown and a shake of her head, she backed up a few steps and typed a few commands into the wristcom, watching as the security field flickered into existence. She then paused. "You know my name. What's yours?" He nodded slightly, once again, and the ghost of a smile crossed his features before he responded. Aran, but trailed off for a moment and then sighed and continued. "Sorry. Always forget I'm not permitted to give my surname to even allies. For now, let's just go with Aran Werda." Marin froze for an instant as she caught his correction. She felt what he'd been about to say in her gut, and her eyes narrowed momentarily. Shaking her head, she decided to let it go, stepping away and up to the small food prep area upstairs. After a few minutes, she returned with a small tray that held a steaming mug of bihat and several flaky chunks of gihal wrapped in wax paper. She deactivated the security field again and slid the tray towards him with a shrug as she watched. He caught on to the fact that she reacted to so much as the first letter of the surname and inwardly sighed. This was going to be interesting. Simply pacing until she returned, he turned back to face her as she did, offering an appreciative nod as she slid the tray over. Moving over to it, he shifted to a seated position and took an experimental sip of the bihat. His eyebrows rose briefly, and he took another slow draw, savoring the flavor. This done, he set the bihat down and set about slowly and calmly chewing on the gihal. It was what he'd been living on anyway, so he was used to it. Swearing softly, Maren leaned against the edge of the table in the center of the room. Folding her arms still caused her to wince in pain. At 15, she found it strange that she had faced more things than many her age. There was a moment of silence, and then she asked, "Did you know what clan Jairus was part of? After his rampage, he was found by a Mandalorian and adopted. She knew none of her clothing had the Bevan sigil. She knew none of her clothing had the Bevan sigil embroidered on it, so she was testing his knowledge." Shrugging, he looked at her momentarily, and then sighed in exasperation. "I honestly couldn't say. I was only told the name and what he looked like. For all I know, Durza could have been the clan name." He was trying to figure out what she was getting at, but that wouldn't keep him from answering to the best of his ability. "It's not," she said, quietly, absently playing with the hem of her fatigue jacket for a moment. Something else occurred to her. "Were you given the names of anyone else?" The silence was broken as he responded quietly. Nash, just two. My job was to find a house. Nothing more." Frowning again, Maren shifted against the table and winced as the action pulled at her still healing side. The wounds from Coruscant had healed, but they still pained her at times. For a few moments she considered what to say next. When she did speak, it was quiet, so he had to lean forward to hear. "I was given a Vergoten several months ago to assist in removing old Kirtsod from Katani space. While that was mostly successful, or so I thought, the fact that you are here begs otherwise." She swore softly. Were the Kirtsod movements incursions into Katani space, or were they for some other purpose? She knew that Kirtsod was working with the Sith Empire, but she didn't know if it was because of Joran's crusade or for other reasons. Moran listened to this intently, weighing each word carefully. He wasn't well informed on why Kirtsod was so interested in Katani space, but he did have something that could be useful to her. He responded just as quietly, carefully sliding something from under a few plates from under the center of his chest plate as unthreateningly as possible. It was a data pad, which he slid over to the security field. "I'm not going to pretend to know what was being planned, but I do know this. Joran wasn't the only one interested in Katani space. There seemed to be a great deal of focus on gathering intel about some academy or some, I'll say, Detize, I think. That datapad has the coordinates for a few of the recon groups and listening posts on many of the moons and such, including this one. I can almost guarantee most, if not all, of the recon groups have moved on by now, but listening posts should still be there, manned or otherwise." It took all of Maren's self-control not to react, but even so, something passed over her face before she turned away. She used the few seconds it took to retrieve the datapad to compose herself. Now it all made sense. Joran's questioning of her, and his methods. Sure, there was the vendetta between him and her family, but that was settled now. This was something else, and further confirmed her initial findings on Coruscant and her earlier suspicions. That Kirtsod were working with the Sith. Only the Sith would be so interested in the Praxium, and Joran's vendetta had given them even more reason to push into Katani space. She shuddered slightly at the memory and flexed her left hand at the remembered pain. "Why would you share this with me?" Her reaction was noted, but he didn't comment. Instead, he waited until she posed a question again, and responded without hesitation when she did. "Quite simply, I don't have comms. Everyone that knows where I am is dead, and anyone else that would care to thinks I'm dead. I've been abandoned by those I considered allies. What reason do I have to not? As you say, she responded softly, tucking the datapad into a trouser pocket for later analysis. It was probably encrypted anyway. She lifted the backpack from the table and moved towards the secure lockers by the stairs. She then placed Aren's gear in one of these and engaged the lock with a swipe of her thumb. That's true. I found enough evidence to support that. Sighing softly, Aren drained the remainder of his behot before he calmly set the empty tray and cup back to the security field. He then set about removing the rest of his Beskar gam as he spoke, also placing this in a pile by the security field. Aye, anything else you would like to know? When he removed his Beskar gam, he slid several small objects from hidden pockets in his bodysuit. These contained a fair number of small items, credit chips, old-fashioned lockpicks, and even a few small knives, which he set by the security field. He stepped back, allowing her to quickly remove all of this from the cell if she so chose. Her eyes widened slightly as she watched him, and she returned to leaning against the table momentarily as she watched him do this. Something nagged at her, and she turned the thought over in her mind before she spoke. If you're willingly cooperative, what drew you to Kirtsad? An affiliation or something else? She had a guess, but she was honestly curious. We have an ad starting in 4 minutes and 45 seconds. He frowned at this and sighed heavily before he responded. Clan affiliation specifically. I was adopted into it, but didn't have much of a better option at the time. Shrugging, she moved forward to collect the tray and set it on the table before moving back to collect the Beskar gam, knives, and other items. He stood now in only his coverall and boots, but she knew better than to trust him. He was still Kirtsad. But the events surrounding the arrival of colonists had proved to her that people could change for the better. But would it still work for someone raised in such a culture? She was silent for several seconds as she considered that. If allowed to do so, would you leave, Kirtsad? As he thought it through, this question was met with dead silence for several minutes. Kirtsad had taken him in, but now they had abandoned him. Besides, was he honestly in agreement with their ideas and methods? No, he couldn't say that he was. He was quiet when he finally responded, but a firm resolve was evident nonetheless. I think I would. Nodding quietly, she moved away from the security field and placed the additional Beskar gam and knives in the locker, closing and securing it again before she returned to her spot. She stepped closer to the security field now, her blue eyes locking with his green ones. I encountered Bevan on Coruscant. They were indeed working with the Sith and were trying to plant bombs around Galactic City. Aren's blood ran cold at the entire statement, and his eyes widened briefly before he abruptly slumped back to his seated position against the wall. He stared blankly at her before he shot a short question. He gripped tightly at something under his coverall around his neck. You're sure? Fairly certain, yes. She sighed and gave him an apologetic shrug as she hesitantly reached out into the Force, projecting an image of Bevan in his armor. Swearing softly, he abruptly stood and tore something from around his neck. He slowly backed off, not taking his eyes off the object, and flung it violently at the security field. It was oddly weighted and shaped as it fell a few inches short of the field. His Bevan clan sigil. He tried stammering out a few things, but failed miserably. Seeing and hearing that had put him out of sorts rather badly. That's the end of that's actually the end of chapter 4, which it is 9:30, so I think we're gonna stop there. But thank you guys for hanging out. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed. And I will be reading again in 2 weeks. My next stream is going to be next Wednesday, which is the hold on. My next stream next Wednesday is going to be the 28th. I'll be playing SWTOR, 7 p.m. And then my next stream after that is going to be June 1st. Yes, June 1st, which will be a writing workshop. And then the following Wednesday, June 4th, I will be reading more chapters of A Warrior's Heart. Hope to see you all there. I'm going to take a moment and see if I can find us a raid target for this evening. So hang tight, and I would greatly appreciate if you guys could tag along. But please, if you have any questions before we dash off on our raid, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I would love to answer them for you. We have an ad starting in 36 seconds. Oh my goodness. Sorry. It's been a busy day. Okay. Seeing if there's anybody else that's writing on fanfiction. If anybody has a suggestion on a raid target, that would also be cool. Welcome back from that ad, guys. I appreciate you. I'm going to somebody in the same category. I'm still checking. Sorry, I'm super focused on what I'm doing. But I do hope that you guys enjoyed the chapters tonight. I hope you found it interesting. Like I said, I would love to know what you guys think. I would love to hear your feedback. Always trying to improve my writing. Actually going back. I found a stream where somebody was actually reading, so I think we're gonna go say hi to a new friend named Hina. She is not actually sure what she's reading, but she is reading a book. So let's go say hi. I appreciate you all being here this evening and hope you have an awesome rest of your week. Oh, hi Lord, just as we're getting ready to raid out, we'll come in. This first raid command is for anybody that is subscribed to the channel. And then this second one is for anybody who is following the channel or otherwise just hanging out with us and listening. And if for anybody that is here, I do greatly appreciate you, and I hope you really enjoyed the story tonight. So we're gonna go say hi to Hina, and hope you guys tag along for the raid. Thank you all for being here this evening, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. Oh, can I not raid? Okay, that's actually not working. Okay. I guess we might need to go say hi to someone else. Give me a second. I was gonna raid her, but apparently the raid is not working. She may have them turned off. Which is okay. It happens sometimes. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, oh, okay. Alright. Trying to raid into somebody that I haven't raided for a while, or haven't raided at all. Ooh. Yes. We're gonna go say hi to Sea Doodle, who is a member of the Survivor Squad, I do believe, which is the stream team that I am part of. She is currently playing BioShock Remastered, and it is her first playthrough. So we're gonna go say hi. snag those raid messages, and we're gonna go show her some love. I appreciate you guys, and I hope you have a great evening. There we go. Thank you guys so much for being here. I appreciate you. Have a great night.